I'm going to make the briefest of introductions and just tell you a little bit about why we had this opportunity, which is this week we have what our staff calls Watch Week. Every 2 years we issue the World Monuments Watch that provides an opportunity to talk about endangered sites around the world. So for us, it's a very exciting time because the New York staff and the non-New York based staff get to spend a whole week together, which doesn't happen very often that we're all in the same place. And it's a great opportunity to learn about sites around the world and figure out what kind of statements we can make through the watch. And as the week goes on, we all become partisan and fight for our favorite sites. But that's all part of putting together what we hope is a very compelling list every 2 years. But for me, even before I worked at the World Monuments Fund, I used to wait with great expectation every 2 years because it was a wonderful opportunity to learn about places I'd never thought about or visited, and in many instances had never heard of. But as the list has evolved and the field has evolved, what I've discovered is it's really not just the sites and their history and their beauty. It's really the portal that they open for us to learn deep passages of history that oftentimes we discover we know far less than we thought we did about places or periods of history. And so this opportunity tonight to have Mel Garber and Stephen Battle talk about Bunce Island is just such an opportunity. About 10 years ago was really the first time I heard about Bunce Island in great detail, and it was because of another watch site. And I actually heard about Mel at that time, and he was a somewhat mythic figure for me. And then a few years later, through Glenn Bornasian, who's an architectural conservator here in New York, who's been a consultant to WMF for many years, and Norma Barbacci, who until recently was on our staff, also an architectural conservator. I had the opportunity to meet Mel, and the myth became the man, and I learned that Bunce Island has a lot to teach all of us, and through Mel's efforts and his talk tonight, we're going to hear not just about his work as a structural engineer, but really what this site means very personally to people from Sierra Leone, and the lessons we can all draw from that wherever we're from. And Stephen Battle is our specialist for Sub-Saharan Africa, and he's worked for WMF about 8 years now. And before that, had a 20-year career, also working in Sub-Saharan Africa, but also other parts of the world. So tonight, Mel's going to tell us a great deal about Bunce Island, and hopefully many things many of us are learning for the first time. And Stephen's going to talk about the context of our work in Sub-Saharan Africa and some of our aspirations for Bunce Island and other sites. So with that very brief description, I'm going to turn it over to Mel to provide us with this great portal to a place that hopefully one day we'll all visit.
Thank you very much, Lisa. It's definitely an honor to be here and to have this opportunity to speak to all of you about something that's very passionate to me. It's I've been involved with Bunce Island. It's actually about 10 years. And the person who introduced me to it is an American anthropologist called Joseph Opala. And when he found out, I had gone to a talk he was giving about Bunce Island. And at the time, my older brother was actually the chairperson for the Monuments and Relics Commission. And the meeting was down in Washington, D.C. And during question time, I raised my hand to ask a question. And he goes, "You look like your brother." And I go, "Yeah, well, we're brothers." But then he found out I was a structural engineer. And I worked for a firm that did a lot of preservation work at the time. And he goes, "You are the person I really need to talk to." And that's how we got started. And we actually ended up having the very first charrette on Bunce Island I used to work for Robert Silman, that some of you might know. And we had a charrette in our office in DC back in 2007, 2008. and it was really good. And I've been involved, and my wife is here, and she knows me. I'm always talking about Bunce Island, and a lot of my friends know if there's an opportunity to talk about Bunce Island, I always. If I'm talking to you for more than 20 minutes, Bunce Island has to come up. Anyway, so Bunce Island. I've called this presentation the Reawakening History. It's a very tiny island in Sierra Leone, and it is a place that has become, that was very central to the whole slave trade for the British. And I'll go through the reasons why. So I've called the talk Reawakening History, and that is really in honor of Dr. Eastman. Dr. Eastman was the founder of the Sierra Leone Monuments and Relics Commission back in the 1940s. And he went there in the 1940s after it had been abandoned for quite a number of years, over 100 years. Bunce Island is a place where history sleeps, is what he said. Joseph Opala, who I'd also mentioned, said Bunce Island is arguably the most important historic site in Africa for the United States. And finally, Professor Chris de Course, he's an archaeologist and he's the foremost authority on slave castles in West Africa, also said, although the European ruins on the island are less substantial than those in places like Gorée Island and Elmina and Christiansburg in Ghana, but Bunce Island represents the most important European trading sites in this portion of the West African coast. So Bunce Island started operations in 1670, and until 1808 was the hub of the British slave trade. Whilst a significant number were taken to the Caribbean, an even greater number were brought directly to the United States. So this is the map of Africa basically showing where the slave trade was, primarily started from Senegal and all along the west coast, all the way down to Angola, is where the bulk of enslaved Africans were taken from. You did have some that came from Madagascar and South Africa, but they're really, percentage-wise, really a small number. This is a map of Sierra Leone, and I've circled a little in green there, a little area with Pepel at its center. Pepel is on the mainland. And if I zoom in a little bit more, this is the estuary. This is the Sierra Leone River estuary. It opens into the Atlantic here. And you just might be able to see a little tiny thing there. That's why I put the arrow there, which is Bunce Island. This island here called Tasso Island is the largest island on the river. But what makes this very interesting is originally the British, their first fort was actually on Tasso Island. But it was then attacked and demolished by the Dutch in the early 1600s. And then they decided, well, because they knew the flow of the river, they realized that Bunce Island was actually a more strategic location. So that's Bunce Island there. You can see how tiny it is. It's only about 1,600 feet long and about 600 feet wide at its widest. But what they actually found out is because of the way the river is, the deep Sierra Leone, before I go into that, Sierra Leone has the third largest natural harbor in the world. And because of that, what the British realized was the deep ocean-going vessels could come along this way and come this way. And about here was the limits of the deep sea ocean-going vessels. Everything beyond that, especially with low tide, was bad. You could only go in very shallow boats and skiffs. So they basically decided to have their fort on this island here. And this is it. And this area is called Pepel, and the vessels came this way and couldn't go any further north. All this area and going this way up into the hinterland was the river and very low-lying land. So what the British basically did was, the fort on Bunce Island always had fortification. It had cannons which were used for defensive purposes. They were not for offensive. So whenever it was attacked, they would fire off the cannons just to get whoever was attacking them at bay, and then they would pack all their stuff and get a lot of their valuables and people and go away up the river on shallower boats. Bunce Island was so important that it was destroyed and rebuilt 5 times. It was 3 times by the French, once by the Dutch, and once by pirates. Moving along, this is a very old map of Bunce Island, and it has gone by several names. It's been called Bunce Island, Ben's Island. It was also called George Island at one time. And this was one of the early maps of the island, and you can see it has these bastions here. And I'll move on. I do have a lot of slides, so let me move on. And you can see from this drawing, it actually appears to be an elevation of what we saw in the previous map. You could see the fortifications here, and the jetty was down here. There's a ship that seems to have been abandoned there. And of course, the Union Jack is there. This is another view, another map that you can find of Bunce Island. I don't think it ever looked this magnificent. But, this existed, and you can see the jetty where the enslaved Africans were brought down to. And what you can see here is the ocean-going vessel is moored off the island, and what they would do is they would bring the enslaved Africans here, put them on the smaller boats, and bring them along to the boat here. And once they had enough people, then they would set sail. So this is part of the route of these ships from Bunce Island across the Atlantic all the way to Charleston and Georgia. And why Charleston and Georgia? It appears when the British realized that they got into the rice trade, and rice production was a very intensive type of work. And they realized that they couldn't do it. And they also recognized that there were a lot of Africans, especially centered around Sierra Leone, who had been growing rice for about 1,000 years. So they started bringing enslaved Africans from Sierra Leone directly to South Carolina and Georgia. And a lot of them ended up on the Sea Islands here, where they had a lot of the plantations were located. One of the funny, ironical things I actually read not too long ago is that South Carolina, and there's a very strong link between South Carolina and Sierra Leone, but in areas, in the terms of area, square footage, they're both actually almost the same size, which is another interesting fact with Sierra Leone and South Carolina. So, what was all this concentration on South Carolina and Georgia about? This is rice plantation. This is rice farming in Sierra Leone. It's marshy land. It's tedious work, but they've been growing rice in Sierra Leone for, as I said, 1,000 years. And so when the slave trade needed slaves who knew how to grow rice, this is where they came. So they took the enslaved Africans from here to there. And this is Plantation in South Carolina. And here you go. You can see on this flyer they said, Negroes well acquainted with the culture of rice arrived from Bunce Island to be sold on Tuesday. And another one basically saying, 80 brand new Negroes just arrived in the snow chance from Sierra Leone, a rice country. And it was very important for the slave traders to indicate that these Africans came from that region of Sierra Leone or region of Africa because they knew that they knew how to grow rice. And they actually ended up getting a higher purchase price for those Africans who knew how to grow rice and had this ability than other Africans who were not versed in this art of growing rice, because it was. This is a map, a little drawing of rice growing in that region, and you could see the Africans knew the water came this way. They had levees and dikes, and they grew their rice in fields, and the water ended up finding its way all the way to out there. But this was a rice plantation that they had in the Sierra Leone region. This is what it became in Charleston or South Carolina, a huge work. And they basically, I was down in Charleston in March. We were down in Charleston, and one of the amazing things that I found out was that Arkansas right now is the largest rice producing state in America. And 2 years ago, the total tonnage of rice that they produced was 90 million tons. I was told when I went down to Charleston that in 1790, they actually also, through the plantations, they actually produced 89 million tons of rice. Rice was the biggest, contrary to what people might think, rice was the biggest cash crop and the key to the American economy for, I don't know, over 100 years. Charleston was actually the richest city in the U.S. Anyway, let's move on, because that's another story I can talk about for a long time. This is a map of a topographical map of Bunce Island. It shows the slave castle that is there now. This is the close-up, and you can see that there's different areas of it. There's this was called the merchant quarters, is where when the slave traders came, the junior staff all lived here. This was Ban's house, where the owner of the island lived and entertained the captains and other people who came. This was where the kitchen was, and the forge, and this was the office where they traded the business, and this was the fortification, a couple of bastions, and the curtain wall where the cannons were. This was the male slave compound, and this was the female slave compound. And the Africans here were kept in groups of 10, and they were kept in a circle with collar around their neck, and they were in a group of 10 in a circle and were just out there until they could be taken out. And they would give them food in the middle, and the reason they had them in a circle is because they couldn't escape without getting somebody else to try and go with them. And you will see some of the what it looks like with pictures. And finally, before I leave here, they had these back terraces. This back terrace is where they actually had they entertained guests as well, and they actually had a 2-hole golf course there. Yes, amazing. But they had a 2-hole golf course there. Now this is an aerial image that we took in January of that same site. This is the Bunce house. These are the merchant quarters. The bastions are sort of there. But as you can see, there's a lot of vegetation. And this is the original jetty there. This is a computer-generated model of what it would have looked like in 1796 to 1808. Again, this was the very last slave fort that was built on Bunce Island. And it's also very important because in 1792, you had some freed slaves who were called, we call them the Nova Scotian settlers. They were actually part of the black loyalists who had fought with the British in the War of Independence here. And the British had told them that if you fight with us, you'll be given your freedom. So a lot of the slaves escaped and fought with the British. Some were freed blacks who fought with the British. Of course, the British lost. And the British took them to Nova Scotia, which was even more hell for a lot of them. They then negotiated with the British to go back to Africa. And they ended up in Sierra Leone in 1792 and renamed the settlement Freetown, which is the capital. In 1794, when the French and the British were fighting during the French Revolution, the French actually came down the coast, came to Sierra Leone. They sacked Freetown and destroyed it, and then went upriver and destroyed Bunce Island. That was in 1794. By 1796, it had been rebuilt because the slave trade was still going on. And this is what it was, somewhat what we think it looked like. But it was also rebuilt with the help of those freed slaves. So it's the only slave fort anywhere in the world that was built with the help of freed African slaves. This is another view of what it might have looked like. You can see the cannons, you could see the office building here, and the main house. So, 1808, the British decided to abolish the slave trade because they realized it was inhumane. And Bunce Island was used maybe for about 20 years to sell camwood and wood, and it really never made the kind of money it did before. And so by the late 1820s, it got abandoned. It was abandoned. And until really Dr. Eastman went there in 1943, 45, or 48, 49, it was just forgotten about. It's a totally uninhabited island right now, so nobody lives there. Dr. Eastman went there, and I actually have a friend here, Gary Schultz, who actually was an American Peace Corps who went to Sierra Leone in the 60s and worked with Dr. Eastman. And I think he knows some of these pictures that I'm going to show. But just so you understand what happened to Bunce Island. 130 years of nobody going there. Sierra Leone has the heaviest rainfall in Africa. So vegetation just grows. So we get probably 150, 160 inches in 6 months. That's how much rain we get. So Dr. Eastman goes there. I think these pictures are in early 60s, Gary? 1960s. This is part of what he saw. Some of the vegetation. This is the house, the Bunce house. This is the kind of vegetation that had overgrown it. You can see the trees coming out through the window, and just huge. This is the main entrance. You can see another huge tree there. And this last one is a picture of, there's Dr. Eastman, and that's all the vegetation around the house, just to give you a sense of scale. So a lot of people, over the last few years, I've always been posting things about it, and I've had people say, look at the condition of Bunce Island. When you look at Elmina or Gori, those places are, huge and imposing, but this just looks like the government is doing nothing. It's not the fault of the government. This was just abandoned, and the vegetation took over. I don't know if people sometimes watch, there's one of these shows, if The World Without People, and how things just grow. And this is a testament to it. So this is what they met, and then after this, they did go and cut down a lot of these trees. And in the 60s, they also made a model of the slave castle as it was then. And Gary is here to keep me honest here with regards to the model is in the Sierra Leone Museum. So this is a model of the island after a lot of the trees have been cut down, and you could see the entrance here and the paths going in, the house, merchant quarters. And some of these things have collapsed. This, for example, this entrance is now collapsed. And I'll talk about all the threats. Let me just continue here. So this is another view, again, of the model. This, again, is the men's quarters. The women's quarters was here. They had actually anticipated extending the piece of land. I mean, it's cut off, but I think they had wanted to extend the operations here, but then the British abolished the slave trade, and so they had to stop. Now, as a structural engineer, this is part of what I do. There are certain threats to Bunce Island that really have to be addressed. The first is the vegetation, and I've been talking about heavy rains and what you have. So what you have here, this was taken in 2009 when I went there. I think it was in October or November, and they hadn't done any clearing, so the rains had just stopped. You can see all the grass there; it's all very green. But what has happened over the years is, and you find this in other sites, but the roots have become integral with the structure, and right now we don't know which one is holding what. Here's some more of that. The roots there over the doorway, and it's just the trees have grown on top of this. And one of the big problems with this, there's one more, and this shows it even in starker detail, is that you now have this huge tree that's grown on top of the wall, and maybe similarly here. And as those get bigger, they actually act as a sail. And, the roots actually now are integral with the wall. But it could become that the sail becomes such a big sail that it actually just topples over, even though the roots are now going into the ground and it's being held up. And that's one of the main things we have to get a grip on, and we really need a botanist or somebody who can tell us how we can mitigate, this extensive growth so that all these structures don't collapse. Another significant threat is erosion. This is the pictures I took in January of underside of the bastion. This is the north bastion. So the bastions are the semicircular structures that you saw. So on the backside of the one that was next to the office tower, the underside of it is being eroded. The ground, as you can see, it falls away steeply, and the underside has eroded. And if we don't do something soon, it will reach a tipping point for the bastion, and it will just slide down, and there'll be another collapse. And there's also erosion of the island itself. Whereas when the river, during the rainy season, the river swells, I think it can probably get 10, 12 feet higher. And it does deposit a lot of sediment on one side, but it also erodes, and there's a lot of scour from the rivers flowing by. Now, recent structural collapses, and these are a few of the reasons why, for me, it is critical that we do something to mitigate this. So I was just talking about the North Bastion. This is the South Bastion. In 2010, there was a group called Atkinson Noland, as engineers, who they do a lot of preservation work. They went to Sierra Leone to do a full structural assessment of Bunce Island. I was part of the Bunce Island Coalition. And this person here is Joseph Opala, who I worked closely with and who got me interested in this. So they cleared all the vegetation around the bastion. And you can see there's huge cracks there. They did measurement and said, this thing is leaning significantly, and we need to do something. So in 2011, they put in shoring. They put timber shoring on two sides of this. You can see it's closer here. And then the funds dried up. For one reason or the other, $5 million had been allocated for work here after, I think, really spending less than $500,000. The work stopped. There was a donor who had promised this amount of money, but somehow it stopped. Anyway, nothing happened. 2011, everybody left and went away. 2012, I got a message from the Monument and Relics Commission, probably from Joe, through the Monument and Relics Commission, saying the South Bastion collapsed. And we were just aghast. And you can see there's some shoring here. You can see another piece of shoring here. But this area had been braced by the other shoring, and there was a collapse. We're not too sure what precipitated the collapse. Part of it is the heavy rains and the soil. You can see how brown this is. It's very saturated soil here. But what we think also happened is some of the people in the villages, because the island is uninhabited, there was nobody there. Some of the people came and removed some of the shoring for the wood to cook, and didn't understand the implications. And this is the result. Again, this is another view of it. This is 2012 when I went. 2012 pictures. This is when I went in January. You can see this little tree here. That's it's sort of there. So, the vegetation is growing, but that's a significant collapse of the bastion. This is what was left of the office tower. In 2007, when I went and I saw, and as an engineer, my mouth hit the floor when I saw this crack in this wall. And I was just amazed at the corner here. This was the tallest building. It was 3 stories tall. You could actually see the holes where the steps were that led up to the next floor. But I saw this crack. You could put your hand through the crack, and it was like, whoa, this is a big problem. In 2010, when they went to do the study, they also said, yeah, this is a big problem. But this wall was actually leaning more that way, and it was unbraced. There was nothing holding it apart from the corner. In 2013, we got a message that the wall on the other side had collapsed. And this is a picture. This is a couple of pictures I took in 2017 showing that the wall on this side is no longer there. The wall with the big crack that I was concerned about is still there. In 2010, they put what we call crack gauges over the crack to monitor the cracks. When I went there in 2017, in January this year, that crack gauge had fallen down. So obviously, the crack is getting wider. This is called the powder magazine room. And I have to tell you guys a little story about this. This is where they actually kept the gunpowder. A few years ago, I went to some event in New Jersey and met some people who had gone to Sierra Leone. And one of the guys was talking about that they had gone to Sierra Leone, they went to Bunce Island, and the caretaker who took them around was telling them stories about it. And they got to this place, and the caretaker said, well, this is the place when they had some of these slaves who were very troublesome. They kept them in here and locked them in and just kept them in there. And you can sort of still smell these people. And the guy goes, I went in there and I could smell them. And I said, but actually it's a powder magazine room. There were no people there. The only thing that's there now are bats. They're very tiny. There's some miniature bats that live in there. But I just found it, and the guy goes, really? I go, yeah, there were never people there. I said, geez, I really could smell this people that were there. I said, no. But anyway, I digress. So this is my picture in 2007. And then in 2010, when Atkinson Nolan came, it had failed. So you can see the entrance there, and this had slipped, and it was precariously perched there. So they put some bracing in there to hold this up, to be able to do whatever work needed to be done. Of course, as I said, the money ran out. Nothing was done when I went in January. The shoring is still there, and it still looks okay, but really, in reality, it's all rotted at the base. The wood is all loose. So it's not really doing what it was supposed to be doing. Now, there's some other structural defects that we have to address, and it's part of the study that I went to do. The first is the Bunce house. This is one of my biggest concerns, is that I took a picture a bit further back and then blew it up came a little closer. But you can see here, there's the roots of these little trees are going in. It's gone in here. It's lifted this bit up, and you can see that and pushed this bit of brick outwards. So if nothing is done, it might look a little very tiny tree and its roots, but the roots are really ingrained, and as the roots get bigger, it just pushes things out. And it potentially can cause, if this should fall, I think this would fall, this would fall, this would fall. And that's a significant piece of the house that would be lost. Here again, there's a tree actually on top of this, and its roots have come, and they've gone behind, underneath the plaster here, and have popped the plaster, and they've come down this way and gone in, and it starts at a very tiny root, but you can see it's getting bigger. Here it got behind the brick, and it's popping the brick out. And this again was a lintel over the window. Part of it had fallen off, and there's another piece that's precariously hanging there. So, all this needs to be cleaned, and there's a lot of vegetation growth and grass on the top surfaces, and when the rains come, they absorb a lot of the moisture. The roots are wet, and they start expanding and could cause more of a problem. This is the famous back terraces I was talking about, where they played golf. In 2011, they realized when they did their test, they saw this wall, the back terrace wall was leaning, it was like 15 degrees from vertical. So they put some shoring in, nice clean looking shoring, and I think the folks who came to steal some of the wood didn't realize there was wood at the back here. Because it all gets covered with vegetation. So even though you can see it's very clear now, it gets covered with vegetation. We went there in January and it was totally covered. They cleared it for us. And the people didn't see it, but the termites did. And the termites had a field day. So some of this just totally collapsed. So we need to reinstate it, and prevent further collapse. So I show this to show the jetty. This is the jetty, the original jetty where the enslaved Africans were taken off. There's a cannon that's part of it now that's encrusted into the jetty. There were a couple more, actually. When I went in 2007, there were a couple more cannons on the jetty. There was like 3 of them. By 2010, the other 2 had gone missing. Mm-hmm. And, again, I think part of it was because, there was a caretaker there, but they didn't realize the importance of this place. And so they either somebody bribed them or somebody came when they went there and took those cannons. But this is low tide and this is high tide. And there's a cannon over there. So you can see how far up the water has come up during the high tide. Colin Powell went to Sierra Leone in 1990, did a tour of Africa, and went to Sierra Leone and went to Bunce Island. And he was so moved by visiting this place. He said, I'm an American, but today I'm something more. I'm an African too. I feel my roots here in this continent. And I think one of the things that makes Bunce Island such a unique place and such a powerful place is because when you go there, you realize that the last time this place was busy was when the slave trade was going on. Because it is one of the few places that once slavery was done, they basically just abandoned the place. So I remember meeting Isaiah Washington, and we were talking about Bunce Island. He was saying, we should rebuild. And I said, no, I'm a preservationist, you should preserve. And he goes, have you ever been to Bunce Island? I don't know, but I'll be going there at the end of the year. And he goes, when you go, call me from the island and tell me what you think. So I went, and it is really like going on hallowed ground. People are chatting and stuff. The moment you walk into the complex, everybody becomes quiet. And Eugenia Chinsman here knows. She's a travel agent. She's taking people there. It is a very, very powerful place. And for me as well, I am a Creole. The Creoles are the descendants of the freed slaves who went back to Africa or who were being taken as slaves when the British abolished the slave trades and the boats were intercepted and they were brought to Sierra Leone. So I am a descendant of those people who built this slave fort. They might not have been my direct descendant, but I'm part of those people. And I have some of my Creole family here. So for me, it's personal. It's something that I feel, as long as I am able, I want to preserve this. And I'll leave you with something that I told one of our former ministers of tourism and cultural affairs. I had gone to Sierra Leone I think it was in 2009. And I remember my mom coming home one morning and saying, I was at the radio and the Minister of Tourism and Cultural Affairs was there, and he was talking about getting some of these mining companies to invest in Bunce Island. And I was just livid. It was like steam. I said, mining companies, Bunce Island? No way. I'm going to go see the minister. Jumped in the car, got to the ministry. So I said, I'd like to see the minister. They said, upstairs. So I went up. The secretary was there. I said, I've come to see the minister. And I said, yeah, I'm just going to sit here. I have a couple of hours. I can just sit and wait. So she went in and she goes, well, wait. And after about 10 minutes, he said, oh, you can go in. So I went to see him. He was actually a person who was a rebel in Sierra Leone in the 70s called Hindoloto. And he goes, Mr. Garber, how are you? I said, I'm fine, minister. So, what are you here for? So I said, well, I wanted to talk about Bunce Island. I said, this place is so important to Sierra Leone. I said, I went to the best high school in Freetown growing up. I said, not once did I ever know that there was a slave fort just up the river, 15 miles up the river. I said, this is wrong. I said, schools need to understand about, this history. And so he goes, yeah, okay. So what are you planning to do? I said, well, look, I put a proposal together. I want to see if we can raise funds to do this. And he said, okay, we should meet again, but unfortunately I couldn't meet him. Then Joseph Opala, I came back, and then Joseph Opala got this philanthropist, and they got this money, and they went to Freetown. And they went and they did their study, and they came back. And as soon as Joe landed at Dulles Airport, he called me, and I was sorry. He goes, I just landed. I go, oh, how was it? He goes, what did you do to the minister? I go, what do you mean? He goes, that minister, every time we met, and they met about 7 times, told him, do you know Melbourne Garber? He goes, yes, he's part of the Bunce Island Coalition. He goes, he has to be involved in this project. He goes, I kept telling him you were already there, but every time we met, he would say, do you know Melbourne Garber? He should be involved with this project. He goes, he is. And so that minister passed away about 4 or 5 years ago. And I sort of said, my promise to him is, as long as I am able to, I will work to stabilize and preserve this, not just because of him, but because the history is so important and its connection to the US. And on that note, thank you for listening. I actually have a little slide, 1 minute thing. Where's Ed?
Yes, sir.
I've got a little YouTube thing I would like to show.
Okay.
I'm not too sure how we...
Well, while Ed helps you get loaded up, I'm going to say after Stephen talks, we'll have a chance for some Q&A. So people with questions for Mel can hold them. But I think, Mel, you've set it up so that we have to invite you back very soon. Chapter 2 of this lecture. I'm serious that we'll have to have Mel come back because there's so much more to say about Bunce Island. And it's on the 2016 World Monuments Watch, not because it's the only slave trade site in Africa, but because it's one that does have these incredible connections, both to British history and American history. And it really is on the watch, not just as a call to action to hopefully preserve it in the best way possible, but also to help us all understand that preserving these sites is preserving parts of history that we don't always want to remember, and we really have to. And I think that one way in which the watch has evolved over the years is really pushing the boundaries of what heritage is in a broader and broader way so that we don't see these as isolated buildings, but understand where they fit into history. And before Stephen comes up, I just want to say that the World Monuments Watch started in 1996, but our organization started in 1965, and started by a structural engineer, in fact. And I think what preservation brings out in all of us is architecture and structural engineering seem quite easy in comparison to preservation. And, we all get so passionately drawn into these projects because they are so much more than just the skills we learned in school. And even though WMF has not had a lot of projects in Africa, ironically, our very first major field project was actually at Lalibela in Ethiopia in the 1960s and went for several years before the team concluded its work. And then it was a long time, really until the World Monuments Watch launched in 1996, that we had the chance to come back to Africa and work more systematically at a number of sites. And our hope actually is that we will find ways to raise money for Bunce Island because we really feel that it's one of the touchstones of African culture that will be an important touchstone for all of us in the future. And with that, I'm going to let Stephen talk a little bit about some of the projects we have now.
So thank you. So I'm an architect, actually, and in the profession, we tend to think of structural engineers as rather kind of dry and kind of passionless beings. My apologies to any other structuralists, but Mel here clearly has exploded that particular myth, which is fabulous. Thank you. It was a very interesting and passionate presentation. So just to put this in a little bit more context as well, World Monuments Fund does not, at this point in time, have a project at Bunce Island. It was on our watch list, but we have submitted a proposal to the US State Department, the Ambassador's Fund for Cultural Preservation, and we are hopeful that we will hear soon, assuming the program doesn't get cut between now and then, that we will get a grant. And at that point, then we're hopeful that we will be able to actually do some conservation work. I'm going to come and talk about that a little bit more in a short while. And I'm not going to say too much. I think the main focus is Bunce Island, but I just wanted to also then just give you a little bit more context about some of the other things that we're doing in Africa. So there are several things about working in Africa that are different. And the first, of course, is the context. And Africa tends to be a continent of extremes, which is actually what makes it such an interesting place to work, as far as I'm concerned. It's a continent of extreme diversity, first thing to say. There is no other part of the world that is so diverse culturally as Africa. And this is reflected in its cultural heritage, which is unique and incredibly rich and incredibly varied. Take, this is Bandiagara in Mali, where it's a site where World Monuments Fund has had a project. But you take one other country, Ethiopia. Lisa mentioned Lalibela. It's a site where we've been working as an organization for many years. In fact, it was I think the first site or the second site the World Monuments Fund became involved with back in 1965. And in Ethiopia, in this one country, there are 88 individual languages. And each one of those languages has a distinctive cultural set of traditions attached to it. By comparison, there are only just over 400 Indo-European languages, which means all the languages in Europe and all the languages in the Indian subcontinent. So you can see that in just one country, just in Ethiopia, there are 88 separate languages. I mean, the diversity of the continent is quite extraordinary. And there are estimates that the total number of African languages varies from between 2,000 and over 3,000. It's diverse. The diversity of the continent is truly remarkable. It's also a continent in a process of rapid transition. Now, you may think of Africa as a largely agrarian society as a whole, but this is no longer true. In Sierra Leone, I looked it up. In fact, in Sierra Leone, there are 40% of the population live in cities, and it's expected across the continent as a whole, within the next 20 years, fully 50% of people will be urbanized. This is Zanzibar. It's one example. And the city of Zanzibar, population of the city of Zanzibar has doubled in the past 20 years. It's grown from 200,000 is now close to 500,000. Incidentally, we've just finished last year a project in Zanzibar at the site of the last open slave market in East Africa, which in fact was closed on the orders of the Sultan of Zanzibar in 1872. And I think the Brits came along afterwards, bought the site and built a cathedral on the site. And what we've done is we've done conservation work on the cathedral, and we've also created an exhibit at the site telling the story of the site and the slave trade in East Africa. And I think it's interesting because it's something that people are less aware of, the prevalence and the size, the scale of the slave trade in East Africa, and also the fact that it went on so much later than it did in West Africa as well. The speed of transition in Africa is very rapid, and as society changes, so traditional ways of life are changing as well. And traditional cultures are being lost at a very, very rapid rate. What is also different about Africa is the percentage of built heritage made of ephemeral materials, earth, grass, timber. And what you find is that when traditional ways of life change, people move away from their villages, from their traditional homes, their ancestral homes to cities, then those systems, those cultural systems, which maintained these monuments, these buildings made with ephemeral materials, they break down very rapidly. And because these materials are so vulnerable, within the space of 2 or 3 years, buildings simply crumble, because particularly with earthen buildings, they need to be maintained and renewed on a regular basis. So African built heritage, because so much of it is made of these ephemeral materials, is uniquely vulnerable to the changes that are taking place on the continent. This is Tiabele in Burkina Faso, which was a watch site. And the photographs you see is of the compound where the paramount chief of Tiabele's wives live. And as you can see, the houses there are made of earth with thatched roofs, and they're decorated in these most extraordinary hand-painted decorations, geometric patterns across all the buildings. Very, very beautiful place. The other important difference about Africa is poverty. And it is still the poorest region of the world by some distance. Not only financial poverty, but also educational poverty, the poverty of opportunity, resource poverty, poverty of basic human rights. And, working there, for us, this alters the equation, because to be relevant in Africa, we have to address this poverty in some way, on some level. The recent history of Sierra Leone, I think, is a good example. And, over the past 20 years, the country has endured civil war, followed by the Ebola outbreak, both of which have had a devastating effect on the economy. And so, really, to be relevant working in that context, we have to address the poverty that results from that. So the question is, in this context of poverty, how can we, World Monuments Fund, be relevant as an organization? And I think Bunce Island is a good example of the kind of work that we do. Now, of course, it's not enough to go there, grout some walls, put up some timbered lintels, declare victory, and move on. All our projects in Africa have three main components. Conservation, of course, it's our core business. The projects always have at their center and start with conservation. The image on the screen is of conservation work taking place at Lalibela, a project and one of the 11 churches at Lalibela that we completed in 2016. At Bunce Island, you've seen, Mel has shown a lot of photographs of the condition of the standing ruins there. And of course, as he made the point, rightly so, our role there is really to stabilize those standing ruins, which really means maintaining the status quo. We're not about reconstructing, we're not about rebuilding or restoring. It's really about trying to slow the rate of decay, the rate of change down as much as we possibly can. And it's as you saw, just one of those the problems highlighted there, where the roots growing in and out of the walls that in itself is going to be an extremely challenging problem, but I think that's where. Famous last words. I haven't actually visited Bunce Island yet, but I think that whilst it's certainly challenging, there's nothing there which is impossible. And so I'm confident that we should be able to address those conservation problems, given with the right skill and the right sort of resources there. So. Element one in all our projects, conservation. That's where we start with. But then in every project we implement in Africa, there is always an element of economic development. Sometimes large, sometimes small. But there's always some kind of an element of economic development. Again, it's about trying to be relevant in that particular context. At our project in Kilwa Kisiwani and Songonara in southern Tanzania, we negotiated with the village elders to ensure that as many people as possible from the villages adjacent to the heritage site could participate in the project. And in particular, we set out to employ the maximum number of women, because it's been shown that when women earn, the benefits in terms of family health, children's education, general living standards in the home are significantly higher. And so, in fact, the project in Songonara and Kilwa Kisiwani is very similar to the project at Bunce Island. It's they are islands just off the coast of Tanzania. and they're Swahili sites, but were used for many years as part of the slave trade in East Africa, and but many of the problems that you find at Bunce Island, we also had to tackle at Songonara and Kilwakisiwani. So economic development, it's always a second key element to what we do in Africa. And then the third thing, of course, is training and capacity building. At Lalibela, we've invested in training local craftspeople who have subsequently participated in the conservation work that we've done at the churches and are in effect our guarantee of long-term sustainability, because with those skills in their hands, the fact that they're there, they live there adjacent to the site, means that they can then be brought back to do conservation work and maintenance work down the line. And in the project at Bunce Island, there will also be a very significant training component for local craftspeople and tour guides. So the training and capacity building is a key component of what we do. So as I said, I'm going to wrap it up there. But as I said, we've put in an application to the U.S. Ambassadors Fund for Cultural Preservation, and we're very hopeful that we receive a grant. I hope that you, having listened to Mel, you're as excited about this project as we are, of course, assuming we get the grant, but I think anyway, we'll provide regular updates to everybody through the website, and I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I'm sure Lisa will wrap up again as well, and invite you all to visit Bunce Island at some point in the future, because hopefully by the time we've done our work there, it will be a magnificent place. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming. I know Mel and Stephen would be willing to answer a few questions if we have any. And then after the Q&A, we invite everybody to join us for some refreshments. So are there any questions? Yes, in the back?
Yes, I came in a little bit late with my question
Sure.
from Mel.
Can you stand up just so everybody can hear you a little better?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you said this before I came in. I'm just curious to know, as you surveyed the island, were drawings actually done, plans and elevations in terms of what the structures look like now? Because as they keep collapsing, how does one know, where things were at any given point?
Yeah, the engineers who did an assessment in 2010 actually did plans and elevations of most of the structure. We also identified. We had a whole spreadsheet that identified the different buildings and what were the problems and how the importance associated with them. So some of the things is like there's a tree growing next to the wall. It should be cut down. It's not a critical thing, but it's something that should be done, or the roots growing into the wall is cracked. One of the walls I went to look at in 2010, the crack was about 3 inches wide. When I went in 2017, January this year, it was now just over 4 inches. So there is movement happening, and it might be slow, but unless those things are addressed, you will just suddenly have some collapse, and everybody's wondering what happened. So, it was critical for me, especially after the work was done in 2011 and then things stopped, to go back and just do an assessment, just to say, okay, this is where we are. Some things haven't moved. A lot of the things are still the same, but you can see that there's certain things that are falling and certain things that were not a priority have now become priorities. So and some of the things that were priorities have collapsed, so it's no longer a priority, but it's caused other things to become a priority. Yes.
Thank you so much. This was a very great presentation. My question is, once the preservation is done, what is the vision of the coalition, or what is your vision of what Bunce Island would be after the preservation has taken place?
Okay, so the Bunce Island Coalition doesn't exist anymore. I'm sort of a one-man band now. But the goal of this is really, as Stephen also said, we have to stabilize what is there, and then preserve it for posterity. And for me, the reason why you have to preserve for posterity, one, is for children in Sierra Leone. The young people in Sierra Leone need to know this history. It's not a glorious history, but it is our history. So they need to understand so that they can take care of what it is. Because one of the problems we have in Sierra Leone is, we all know it, it's maintenance or lack of maintenance. But I think the bigger issue is that, or the bigger reason for preserving this is really for the African Americans. African Americans were taken in huge numbers and brought to, again, as I say, to Charleston and South Carolina and Georgia because of that ability to grow rice. The Gullah people in South Carolina and the Gullah Geechee in South Carolina and Georgia, they all know, a lot of them know about Sierra Leone. They know about their connection. They know that the red rice they eat is similar to the jollof rice we eat. They have, a lot of them have middle names that are similar to Sierra Leonean names. Sori is middle name that they have, and they are also slowly appreciating the fact that they want that connection. And my belief is that when you say you're an African American, as I showed in the map, it could mean your ancestors came anywhere from Senegal all the way to Angola. But a lot of them are doing their DNA, and it's finding their roots. If you say you're Italian American, you're not going to say I'm a European American. I'm an Italian American. You know exactly where they come from. And I think that helps to focus, African Americans to the fact that, it's not just African American in general. I'm an African American. My ancestors came from Cameroon, from Angola, from Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone, African Americans doing their DNA now, about 25%, 1 in 4, is finding their roots to Sierra Leone. That's a huge number for a very tiny place like that. And one of the other things people don't seem to realize, slavery lasted for 400 years, plus 300 and almost 400 years. 12 million Africans were taken as slaves and brought across the Atlantic. But only 4% or 500,000 came to the US. So it's a very small percentage that actually ended up in the US. And if 25% of those came from the Sierra Leone region, it is very important for them to know that that's where they come from. And they would want to go back. I believe if they would want to go back and see where they came from. And we have to be ready for them to come and show them this is where your ancestors might have come from. This is probably where they left from. I went to Freetown. I was in Freetown in December, as you were. I went to Waterloo, which is a village in Freetown. And when we went there, it was part of our celebration. They said, we're going to take you down to Slave Wharf. Slave Wharf? Never heard of Slave Wharf before. They took us down to this creek in Slave Wharf, and the guy was starting to explain. First, the lady goes, I'm going to take you down to Slave Wharf. We're going to have somebody here who will tell you about the slaves who were taken to Nova Scotia. I go, what? So I got there, and the guy explained the history as he knew it. So when he finished, because I didn't want to buy, I said, "You've got to adjust this history." I said, "Slaves were not taken to Nova Scotia from here." I said, "That's for sure." I said, "This is a creek. The ships that crossed the Atlantic could never have come this way." Because really, I said, "No." I said, "This area is where they took slaves from here to Bunce Island, and from thence to the Americas." So because I always thought they were. I said, "No. We came from Nova Scotia and came here. We didn't go, And that is the thing. It's the knowledge that needs to be told. And for me, I look at this and immediately when I remember after that, I sent a message to the lady at the Monument and Relics Commission. I said to who you met. I said to, "Do you know there's a slave wharf in Waterloo?" She goes, "You want it on the list of historic sites?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Because this is just amazing. We could have tourists come to Slave Wharf, put them on a sloop, a little boat, and take them all the route for like 3 hours to get to Bunce Island. You will never forget that." But, that's how I see we can bring this history and make it as hard as it is, but real for people.
I want to say one thing, because you said you're a one-man coalition, which is true. But I think, it's important to note that the Monuments Commission is embracing the idea of preservation at Bunce Island. And Isa Smith, who you mentioned, who's chair of the Monuments Commission, I think she's really working very hard to try and raise international awareness as well as national awareness in Sierra Leone. And I think that the coalition had its moment, but getting the government to really embrace the idea of committing resources. And I think, as an example, we have a program with the World Monuments Watch called Watch Day, where we give a small amount of money to sites on the watch to develop a public program. And I think the Monuments Fund did a superb job of developing a program that brought students to the island.
Yes,
really
you did.
Help them kind of understand. So those are baby steps, but they help build a different kind of coalition for this phase of the project.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
There's a couple of questions in the middle. Go ahead. Yeah.
The name Sylvester Rowe was passionate.
It's very just as passionate.
I was a member of BP, we call it, in Connecticut, Sierra Leoneans and Americans, which is Bunce Island Initiative and Preservation. And my question, I think, is for Steve, the point of view of what the Monuments Fund is doing. I mean, all these coalitions and initiatives, they're fine. Projects, and I think Mary knows my feeling about this. I've been pushing with the one-man band, Voice in the Wilderness, to have a comprehensive program for Bunce Island. I suggested so that if the Monuments Fund wants to fund a particular aspect of that master plan. So this master plan will cover conservation, she said, preservation, and the whole thing about sustainable development, because the government looks at the Bunce Island really from a touristic point of view. So I was saying that if you do not develop that resource, how can you bring tourists to bring money? So I've been pushing for a comprehensive plan for Bunce Island. So any organization, any initiative that's interested in part 1 or part 2 or 3 of that conflict, they can go ahead and do it. It was the Ambassador's Fund, where the coast went to dig, and also the legislation of the Commission is under review. Or the Commission man, so to speak, to empower. I always say that Bunce Island and all these things belong to the people of Sierra Leone. we should empower the commission. Of course, the government will grab it up, saying that they are part of the Ministry of Tourism. To have a set of semi-autonomous body that you will deal with, others will deal with. But we need some plan. And the sustainable development part of it is essential, which is the last part. A museum, etc. That's a long term. But if the first part is conservation, this plan will be on top of that. So I welcome and I supported it. I was part of it. Bunce Island Initiative, BP, preservation is no longer functioning. I used to drive to Connecticut for meetings, etc. Last year I had an event at the UN in connection with the slavery. It was very successful. Right. So we have to have a plan. And we can get the commission to be at the center of that architecture. Right. So this, your comment on that. Can you, I mean, you are not going to fund the whole plan, but I suggest that you try to initiate or talk to the commission and come up with a plan that you can make a contribution.
Yeah.
What you're doing now to be part of it.
Yeah. So of course you're right. I mean, yeah. Thank you. It should be, everything that happens at Bunce Island should be part of a master plan, and that's absolutely clear. I think that what's also clear from Mel is that the preservation aspect is critical. This is urgent stuff. So I think it's correct that should be the first component of whatever's done. I think beyond that, I think it's important to say that we work for the Sierra Leone people. It's not the other way around. So we're not. I mean, if we're there, and this is the case with all of our projects in wherever we work, but we're not there as some kind of an autonomous body that can operate apart from the authority that's on the ground. We work for that authority. They're our bosses finally, and and what actually happens, and I personally try and keep this in mind all the time, is that people place their trust in us to do work on these monuments that matter so much to them. And so what I'm trying to say is that whilst I hear what you're saying, it's Aizatu and it's the civil society groups in Sierra Leone that have to take the lead on that. I mean, we can advise, we can use our professional experience, and we can recommend, etc. But we can't take over that responsibility. That's up to also to you, sir, as well, if I may say so.
To take over, I'm saying that this is a body that is responsible.
Which body? The
Monuments Affairs Commission.
Yeah, sure.
That these things belong to the people of Sierra Leone and not to the government.
Yeah, but there's a civil society argument,
So
which
I'm
again.
not telling you to take over their job. You know?
Yeah, no.
I mean, informally. Because I see so many initiatives. They're very good.
Yeah, no, there's, I mean.
But they fail somehow.
Yeah.
They mentioned this, $5 million.
Yeah.
Did it come? 4,500. Where did it go?
That's another story.
That's another story.
Discussion. Okay, I think a couple of people.
I think in fairness, there's a gentleman on this
Okay.
side. We haven't had any questions from this side, and then I think we'll have, yes?
Well, I just wanted to ask Mel if you can talk a little bit about the involvement of not the government in Sierra Leone, but civil society, professionals, community organizations, in terms of restoration, preservation of Bunce Island.
Yeah.
Different institutions.
It's very difficult for these sort of other institutions in Sierra Leone, because the underlying thing is most people are just trying to get by day by day. is the reality of Sierra Leone. Things are tough. This type of thing, doesn't rate high among a lot of people. But I do think the Monuments and Relics Commission has transformed itself to an active proponent of preserving a lot of our historical sites and relics. And I'll give you a good, for instance, is until last year, they have a list of items under their list of historic sites in Sierra Leone. And that list was up to 2015. There was 16 sites that they had on their list as sites of historic value. And they've since, so last year they added 2 more to bring it up to 18. Prior to that, the 16th one was added in 1962. And so nobody really took any of this cultural thing seriously. The Ministry of Tourism has always been like the ministry that the rejects get sent to. It's not fancy and it's not glitzy. Now they're recognizing that it's important and how it could be the ministry that brings in a lot of revenue. I mean, this Bunce Island study, there was a study done by the World Bank, I think towards the end in the 2000s, that basically said for a $5 million investment in Bunce Island, the country could reap sort of within 5 years about $70 million in revenue from tourism. She knows. So there isn't that many institutions. There are people now who are becoming more aware of it because there's been more outreach, but it's still a hard slog. I mean, you were there with me. You saw. Yes.
Good evening. My name is Eugenia Chinsman. I have a company called Man's Travel, and what we've done in the last 18 years is connecting people of African descent with their roots in Africa. And every year I take people to Ghana, to Elmina, we go to Senegal, we go to Togo, we go to Benin, telling the story, connecting people with their roots, doing DNA studies, and we've actually found people who have actually found the tribes or the group that they came from. And Memorial Weekend here, I take people to South Carolina. I do the Gala Festival. And lots of them, I talk about Bunce Island, where they actually originally shipped them from Bunce Island to South Carolina during the period where the Golden Carolina rice was the main intention of bringing people from Sierra Leone to South Carolina. So I am a big, passionate person to see Bunce Island actually being preserved, because I have the people wanting to go, they want to see it, they want to connect with their roots. So I am so glad I came all the way from Connecticut because I cannot miss this evening. And I want to thank Mel for your strength, for doing things like this, for creating an awareness, because we need it. And there are people who really want to go to Sierra Leone, who want to connect with that root, who want to see Bunce Island. And if the preservation could take place, it would be the greatest asset to us in Sierra Leone. Thank you so much.
Well, I think that's the perfect way to end the evening. And I'm going to invite everyone to join us for refreshments where you can continue to talk to Mel and Stephen and other WMF staff that are here. My final comments are that like every nonprofit, we couldn't do this without the very loyal support of donors who care passionately. And the estate of Paul Mellon gave us an education endowment, which is how we're able to hold events like this. And then the World Monuments Watch, our founding sponsor, since 1996 has been American Express. And so we're really very grateful. We have many other donors, but American Express and the estate of Paul Mellon in particular are really what enable us to hold events like this and to run the watch program. So I hope Mel will come back in the not too distant future and tell us more. And I'm really grateful all of you were able to spend tonight with us. Thank you.